So today we hear one of the most normal, everyday, most well-known Bible verses, that whole love your neighbor as you love yourself, the golden rule. And I think it's one of those things that's really easy to say, really easy to understand, really hard to do. And I think all you have to do is go outside and talk to your neighbors and realize how hard this can be. But I think part of what makes it hard is it's also easily misunderstood, and easily minimized, easily made to be something it isn't. And when we read Corinthians, I don't know how many of you have ever been to a wedding. You have that famous Corinthians verse, love is kind, love is compassionate, love is just. It has all those things that love is. I think when we really get to digging down on what Jesus is saying when he says love your neighbor, I think we got to look sort of towards that as to what that love means. Because it's so easy to be kind, which is good, or compassionate, which is good, or just, which is good, but not be loving. Because if you think about what that Corinthians verse says, love is, it's listing all the things that has to be there for it to be love, but any one of those things isn't love itself, right? Love is always kind. But just because you're kind doesn't mean you're practicing love. You might be, but it doesn't mean it. Let me break this down. So let's start off with kindness. So the two sort of images that I like, that I think really highlights kindness very well, and it's been used a billion times by a billion people in a billion sermons, is either the analogy of a hungry person who come and you give them a fish and they eat for a day. Or, before you finish that whole thing, right? Before you finish it, because you've all heard it before, feed a man a fish, or a person a fish, and you feed them for the day. Or you've all heard the starfish analogy, right? A man is walking down a beach one day and he's walking along and he sees that there's starfish strewn all over the beach. So he leans down and he picks up a starfish and he throws the starfish back into the ocean. And someone says, "What good is that?" And he says, "It meant all the world to that starfish." Right? And these are often given as sort of analogies to love. And they're not. Now, both acts are loving because love is kind. But both acts, if you were to just stop there, if all you did was occasionally walk down and throw a starfish back, that's a kind thing to do, and being kind is good. And if you were to see someone who's hungry and feed them, that is kindness, and that is good. And God, by the way, does call us to feed the hungry. That is specifically something Jesus also talks about. And feeding the hungry, because kindness is part of love, could very well be an act of love. It just isn't necessarily an act of love. You guys follow where I'm going with this? Now, for those of you who know the sermons that usually run here, the sermons would then continue on and say, well, it's not giving a man a fish, but it is teaching them to fish so that they never go hungry again, right? That's what you guys almost finished saying when I said the earlier part of the quote. Or some sermons which I thought got really creative, who said, if you really cared about the starfish, you'd organize a group of folks, you'd go down there and you'd throw all the starfish back in the water so that every single starfish landed back in that water and didn't die on that beach. And I'd say, again, those are good things. What those are, however, is compassion. Right? It's compassionate to do job training skills. It's compassionate to go clean the side of the road, to go clean our environment. Those are compassionate things. And God calls us to be compassionate, right? You look at all the things that Jesus says. He says, feed the poor, help the feed the poor, clothe the naked, all these sorts of things. Be with the prisoner and captive, pray always, all throughout the Bible. And those are all examples of compassion. And we learn from Corinthians that compassion itself is also an aspect of love. And therefore, if that is what you have the power to do, then it is love. Right? Because compassion is one way in which love is shown, just like kindness is one way in which love is shown. But just like kindness, compassion itself isn't actually love. And far too often, us as Christians will go to kindness or go to compassion and we stop there. And we say, I fed my neighbor, I have done a great thing. And you have done a great thing. Don't think you haven't. You've been kind. And you fulfilled the commandment of feed your neighbor. That is good. Or you go and you say, I cleaned the side of the road, or I gave to Lutheran Social Services, or I did any number of good social action out there. And don't fool yourself. It is good. And don't fool yourself. You are fulfilling many, many of God's commandments, many of Jesus' commandments about standing with the oppressed, about helping those less fortunate, about being with them in times of trouble. But that is not necessarily love. It is compassion. And while compassion is good, it isn't always love. So what is Jesus getting at when he gets at this love thy neighbor? Well, I think there's a whole nother aspect, a whole deeper level that Desmond Tutu gets to when he says we can pull people out of a river every day, but at some point we have to ask, how are they ending up in the river? And I think this, to me, is the key of the third component that we have to have if we're going to love our neighbor. We must be kind. We must be compassionate. If you don't have those, you're not loving your neighbor either. But we must also be just. Back to those analogies. So it is kind to give them a fish. It is compassionate to teach them to fish. It is just to ask the question, why are we trying to live off of nothing than fish? Right? Like, anyone thought, like, I don't know, we should buy the guy some cheese? Or show him how to garden? Or diversify the economy? Like, what is going on that we can only live off of fish? Maybe we should address those issues. Or in the starfish analogy, you throw the one starfish back. That's kind. There's a whole group of folks to clean the beach and get all those starfish back out there on a regular basis. That's compassionate. But at some point, if hundreds and hundreds of starfish keep washing up on your beach, you should probably get in a boat, go out there and start to scientifically figure out, is the water polluted? Is there a new predator that's killing the starfish? Is there a group of folks who are going out there grabbing starfish and throwing them on the beach as quickly as you're throwing them in the water? Because if you never stop at those questions, if you never stop and fight for justice, then you might be kind. You might be compassionate. Well, you're fulfilling a lot of commands of Jesus by doing that. I'm not sure you're being loving. Now, folks will say, well, what happens if all I can be? If the only passionate, can't that be loving? Absolutely. If the only thing in your power is to be kind, then be kind. That can totally be loving. Because love can show up as kindness. Love can show up as compassion. But I think you need love. But for love to be love, the way Jesus is talking about it here in the Golden Rule, in the greatest rule, in the greatest commandment, we must be kind. We must be compassionate. But we also must be just and fight for that just world that we all know we all need. So as you go out today, what I would ask you to do in your prayer life this week is take a few minutes and ask yourself, like I'd actually get a piece of paper and like a writing utensil or your computer. Ask yourself, how am I being kind to my neighbor? How am I being compassionate to my neighbor? How am I being just to my neighbor? And if you can find things in all those categories, then you can live assured that you are loving your neighbor as you love yourself. Amen.